So we should discuss the agenda for today, what folks would like to accomplish. We had on our list after the last meeting the idea that we would touch base with the modeling. Then we would discuss prioritization and how we will approach the equity screen. We may want to, as we go, particularly with the prioritization, reflect on comments that we heard back from the full council on this committee's recommendations. And just wonder whether anybody had other things they'd like to discuss today.
Rich, I have a question.
Yeah, Joe? Yeah.
Thanks. Nice to see everyone. So beautiful out there. My question is a process question relating to the public engagement and the forums last night. I think there's one more that's going to take place, but Jane and Marion, can you just tell me a little bit more about the process for sort of like rolling up the public engagement feedback and getting that out to us sooner than later would be great, but I'm just curious just the process. Thanks.
Sure. So last night was our last broad statewide engagement event. That said, we are also still hosting a BIPOC affinity roundtable. I shouldn't call it a roundtable, forum online event as well. And that one was supposed to be Tuesday of this week, but due to some sort of serious safety concerns around what was transpiring leading up to the meeting, we had to cancel it at really last minute, very last minute at 5:30, 5:45. It was supposed to start at 6 o'clock. And so we debriefed with our engagement consultants yesterday about how to move forward and if we were able to move forward in a safe manner, respectful of the people who want to participate and engage. And we reaffirmed our commitment and interest in holding a BIPOC roundtable and why it was so important to this process to hear those voices. And so we are moving forward with holding that next Tuesday evening, 1 week from when it was supposed to be, and the same day that we had been scheduled to have Climate Access and RISE present their synthesis to the council meeting. So sort of rejiggering everything in real time right now, but we put a request out to the steering committee of the Climate Council yesterday, acknowledging the issues around being able to synthesize the public engagement by next Tuesday and making adjustments. You'll see a new agenda that was just posted today for October 12th for the council meeting that made some changes to what will be presented and took public engagement off. And I will expect, although it has not been approved by all steering committee members yet, but 2 of the 6 steering committee members who have responded to me indicated support for scheduling a council meeting on October 19th. And so I hope and expect that I will be able to schedule another council meeting actually on the one last remaining Tuesday that we didn't have a council meeting between now and December. We will have a council meeting on the 19th with a focus on public engagement, but I'm sure there will be other topics that will get added to that agenda too. And we're working to schedule a special steering committee meeting for the end of next week to plan fully for that agenda, as well as to start to think about all the upcoming council meetings and conversation and discussion that needs to happen in order to come to consensus around the climate action plan components. So the 19th is when you'll hear a high-level synthesis from the consultants. It's also the week that they intended to go to subcommittees and present more detailed feedback on the specific components of every subcommittee that they heard through the engagement. Their written report will also come out that week. And that's a question around scheduling and timeline with you all about capacity on your agenda to fit in hearing from them along with the work you'll be doing with equity screening that week as well. So the week of the 19th, which is, well, 19th is a Tuesday, so your meeting is the 21st.
I don't know, Joey, I would ask you to weigh in here, but my perspective is that's an area where we would want to spend some significant time hearing that feedback.
Yes. And Jane, thank you so much for that overview. I agree, Peter. And I am just curious, having spent a little time just looking through the public input portal, if the public engagement consultants, if there's something they're going to do with that, or.
We had that's great, that Phil, like, you set us up nicely. Marion and I met with some very gracious DEC staff that hopefully Commissioner Walk is supportive of us tapping into, but we met with Carrie Angstenberg and her new AmeriCorps member on Tuesday of this week to specifically look at how we will incorporate the public portal and feedback that we get online into the roll-up of what we're hearing about with public comments. And then, and we have a plan, we have a formation of a plan happening on how we're gonna pull and roll up all the comments that we received sort of from late summer through this intentional public comment period in order for that to fold into the report and synthesis that Climate Access and RISE provide to all of you. And then we plan to put a very intentional communication up on that public portal about sort of like a shutdown period of that. Likely, we're going to, I want to talk about this with the steering committee as well, but we're probably going to close up the public portal and not receive any more public comment while we're in the sort of heart of drafting. So the month of November, and then we'll want to think about how we utilize that public comment period and public portal going forward. Just recognizing the immense amount of comments it brings forward and what we plan to do with them, how to process them and use them going forward. It needs some thought, I think, because we were falling behind on all those comments and wanted to catch up and are using extra capacity to do so.
All right. I guess I want to return to the question of it. Let me ask first. Sorry, I should have followed up on what we just heard. Comments or questions about engagement with the public outreach portion of our work? Joey, thanks for asking that. It just looks like the week of October 19, we're going to be deeply engaged in processing the public input, both at the council level and at the committee level.
And from an agenda planning perspective, I think that works well. We'll allude to this later on in this meeting, but the next meeting is when, on the 14th, is when we will have Kaya Morris in to discuss implementing the equity screening tool with our work and doing that evaluation. So that's should be a good conversation.
All right. Reflections, and I'm inclined, Peter, to just go into just hearing what people thought about the reflections we heard from the council at our last meeting.
I'd just like to see nodding heads about approving the previous minutes. And then we can do that. All right, great. Now we can go that way.
Okay. I don't have precise questions, to ask about this, but I am, I'd like to open it up to task leads to comment on what they heard from other council members and how you think that may affect the program designs and action steps that you're thinking about, or whether you think we instead, basically what we got were some good questions, but not a change of direction. So,
I guess I would just add to that set of questions that there were some times when the facilitator directed council members to reach out to task leads. I would encourage the same for you from those to those counselors. Obviously, if we have challenges in understanding in order to move our slate of recommendations forward, we should be working to address those from our end as well, and not just wait till both council members to reach out. But just want to reiterate
Excellent.
that.
Right, excellent point. Agreed. Maybe Joey and Gina, I'll start with you. Any reactions?
Well, some folks have their hands up and then we can.
Oh, okay.
I don't
Let's
know
start-
how to put my hand up. I would have handed up, just saying.
No, I see we're doing well.
Disappeared.
Um,
It's
Dave
disappeared, my
lowered his
hand.
hand.
But I think Liz, Jared
Liz,
and Dave
Jared,
had their
and
hands
then
up,
Dave.
then we can go.
Yep, let's go. Liz?
The comment I have is hoping that we as a subcommittee can turn toward how to integrate the recommendations our various task leads have with one another, and then think through how to further integrate that, especially with the rural resiliency subcommittee recs, because they seem most directly overlapping, although there's a few in the ag and ecosystem as well. So I think it's a good exercise to also reflect on individual task lead comments that we got. But I'm really hoping we can move toward how do we make sure it's not just weatherization for all and upgrade electricity panels, but instead a single coordinated, integrated recommendation. And I'm using those two as an example just because they're the most obvious overlap. There's a bunch that overlap. And how do we integrate them?
Okay, very good point. And that became obvious, obviously, in the discussion with the full council. Jared?
Thanks, Rich. This is not as broad of a comment as Liz's, but I do want to elevate one thing specifically that I think is really important in terms of how we do the analysis and making sure that the recommended actions and the plan adds up in terms of our mitigation requirements. And that is the question that was raised about how to count potential emissions reductions related to Vermont's potential participation in the Transportation and Climate Initiative program. Of course, we know via program design that the intent is to reduce by 30% below 2023 levels by 2032 emissions from on-road fuel use across the participating states. But there is a question about whether, how we count that, because it is a little bit different given it's a regional program than some of the direct kind of within Vermont's borders actions that have been floated. I did say at the meeting that I think there's precedent and it could be appropriate to count our share of those, but I do think it's a question that warrants further investigation and care and thought. So I just want to flag that either for this committee or say, I have not yet spoken with my co-chair at Science and Data or other Science and Data subcommittee members, but I would also say, given the amount of other things going on for this subcommittee, a potential action could be a request to the Science and Data subcommittee to do an initial review and make an initial perhaps if we can come to one recommendation on that specific question with regard to emissions tracking and counting, because that was a specific one that came up and I think will be important to resolve given the scale, that the significant chunk of emissions reduction that would be tied up in that specific action. Thanks.
Thanks, Jared. I have a
Jared.
comment on that, but it looked like Gina had her hand up.
Yeah, thanks, Jared and Liz for articulating some major concerns that I had. Overall, I was extremely frustrated that we had to download all this information in 20 minutes, and there were a few good questions, somewhat random, but from that we can delve in deeper where we have to, and we can't just fly on the little bit of information we were able to convey in that instance, or which is on the spreadsheet. We need to identify, and Jared just identified one, some other key issues that merit further investigation. And maybe the information will be coming out of the consultants. So that was just in terms of process, that was a major frustration I had with it. Is this the only chance we get? We put quickly 20 minutes, blah, 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 these major initiatives, and there's a little bit of conversation, mission accomplished. We need to dive in deeper on a few things, on some critical issues, and then have another conversation with them, I hope. Now, I don't know if there's room for that anywhere. So that's my 2 cents.
Thanks, Gina. Chris?
I mean, I shared Gina's concern. I just put in a request to Jane. You may or may not have seen it yet. At steering committee to discuss precisely where we're making room for deliberation and negotiation and all of that around these policy issues, because it struck me, Gina, the same way. As I mean, and you know, we're all developing this process together, right? And while we're doing it, and but it struck me like, you know, here we are, we're talking about these major shifts in policy positions statewide, but the directive, of course, is like, you got 20 minutes, let's keep it tight because we got to keep moving on the agenda. Which I know, which we have to do because we've got a lot on these agendas, but I am a little concerned about where are we making the space for the council to have these deliberations. So if you have thoughts, you may want to share them with your fellow council members in the steering committee. Because I'm personally, this is just me personally, this is not the steering committee, and I am one voice among many. But I'm also beginning to feel like maybe the council is going to need to have like some in-person meetings, because I can't read body language in these things. I can't tell that when an idea is suggested, how is the room feeling about it? You don't have those opportunities to just interact one-on-one or mask to mask. You know, to have those side conversations where you can get a lot of, I don't know, just kind of just discussing things done. So we've got, you know, decision-making process laid out. We've got you know, we've got the drafting process laid out. I'm just a little worried that we may not be carving ourselves up enough time to actually reach this agreement or on the policy decision. So, yeah.
If I could reflect that back to you, Chris, and I don't think this is really fair for Jane and Marion to maybe answer, is to say, here's where we are, right? We've got lots of incredibly substantive work that is difficult for everybody to evaluate because most of us aren't experts on the individual pieces thereof these things. We've got a end date of December 1 to come up with a plan for, or at least the first pass at a plan for addressing a bunch of different things. Somewhere between now and then, we've got to fit as much conversation and reflection and engagement into that to come up with something that we feel we can put our names behind. And how do we think about building a process both at our level and filtering up to the council that actually does that? Is that sort of what I'm hearing, right? And I've been struggling with that too. And I know, you know, Jane is the sort of action end of that, is constantly struggling with that because, but that's the tension, right? We've all, the discussion around TCI as the example was the sort of one policy among many actions that will be necessary, got a tip of the iceberg sort of discussion around many of the issues. But it was substantively more in depth than any of the other conversations really that occurred. And so, how do we go deeper? Or what is the expectation for the council to go deeper? Or are they relying on us to do that? I think if they're relying on us to do that, then we need to know that sort of sooner rather than later, so that we can dig in more depth to bring those forward.
And Peter, to your point, I wouldn't be looking to lay this on Jane and Mary Ann to solve. That's why I thought it'd be important for the steering committee to discuss it, for the actual counselors to figure this out. That's a hell of a burden to put on staff.
Yeah, that's why I interjected. I just wanted to sort of reflect that back, and I appreciate right where you are, Chris. I know that wasn't your intent.
Right. My take on this is similar to Peter's. We have the deadline, and we have the committee structure. And so I think ultimately it's the responsibility of this committee to have deliberated sufficiently among ourselves so that we are content to recommend a slate of actions to the full council. It's sort of like a legislative process with committees doing their work and presenting it to the full body, and to a significant degree, the full body will defer to the expertise of the committee, recognizing that individual legislators still will make their own decisions. But what I take away from this is the fact that the full council is unlikely to have the time to be fully steeped in the work of any of the committees, including ours. So that just makes me feel that we have the responsibility to think it through really carefully and to feel good about the recommendations we're putting forward. And if we want to elevate particular key questions for the council, a discipline we can impose on ourselves is to say, dear council, these are our recommendations, but we think there are these following 6, 8, or 10 key decision points where the debate could be had. And we're not going to ask you to know about everything. We're going to ask you to weigh in on these identified questions. That's one way we could boil it down so that we get good focused input from the others. And while speaking, I actually put my hand up because I wanted to respond to Jared's comment that about TCI. I guess I agree it's an open question whether we could take a pro rata share of TCI reductions that happen across the region. But if Reggie is the analogy, that's not what we do with Reggie. We actually only claim the reductions in tons that come from the changes in the Vermont portfolio. Or if we use Reggie dollars to reduce emissions in buildings or transportation, we count the emission reductions we get from the use of the money, but we don't just count a pro rata share of Reggie's glide path. So I would think that for TCI, TCI is a vehicle for reducing emissions region-wide and for creating a revenue stream to reduce emissions in Vermont, but we should still continue to count the fuel that's consumed in Vermont. Just a quick reaction.
Richard, I appreciate that point. I do think this is a conversation we could go deep down into the rabbit hole on. And
yeah,
I guess I would reflect back to you that I think we should accept Jared's recommendation that we ask the Science and Data Subcommittee to think about this. This is right in that sort of inventory wheelhouse we've asked them to look at other questions on. And certainly they can seek our input, but I think that's the place for it to live.
That's fine. That's fine.
And Jared, I would just encourage you and the others to look at what TCI has produced in terms of memos. There's one in March that really outlines how they've modeled the benefits. And to me, that's critical for you all to look at their modeling and make sure it's legit. and what it says about what the individual participating states' benefits will be. So if it does go, and I don't want to really get into this right now because we have a whole lot to talk about, but the Science and Data Committee, I strongly encourage you to look at what TCI has produced, look at their models, you know how those models work, and tell us if they are legit. That's all.
Thanks.
Thank you.
All right, Fred.
I'm fine with that. Joey?
We can get you the reports too if you don't have access to them, but they are publicly available on TCI's website.
Okay, so I just
I
dropped
would say
three of those.
I will look for those.
I
But
just dropped
Gina
3 of
and or
those.
Joey, if you could please email those directly to me. I don't have access to the chat since I'm on phone and traveling, but thank you for that
Mhm.
recommendation. I also appreciate what Rich said. I think it is a nuanced, not immediately simple question that needs some really careful investigation. I actually think that the precedent that I was speaking to was less about Reggie, because I agree with Rich's interpretation of Reggie. I think it's more about how the renewable energy standard and the regional rec market through ISO New England, and that, you know, we are currently counting emissions reductions related to our purchases of electricity out of state, and to what extent is the regional fuel market for fossil fuels in transportation similar or dissimilar from that, and how would it align or not align with the inventory? Those are not obvious, simple questions, and they need some careful deliberation and investigation.
Thanks, Jared.
But I had a separate comment, but I'm happy to wait in the stack since that was just a direct response, and I think there's others ahead of me.
Thanks, Jared.
All right.
Joey is in front of you. Let's jump to back to Joey.
Thanks, Jared. And while you were speaking, asking for those resources, I had just, I'm sharing here in the chat. And as I say in the chat, I will share with all the counselors, in particular in response to Secretary Young and Secretary Moore, who had specific questions. These 3 resources in particular related to TCI. But I don't need to talk about that now. We can talk about that more when we go through our recommendations, because one of the things I just want to note about, you know, TCI that I think is just important is just continuing to answer the question as we advance our recommendations about how we make them possible through existing revenues, through ARPA dollars or federal funds, or through the long-term sustainable funding streams like TCI would provide in the order of 19 to 27 million in the out years annually, because we can't credibly put, you know, continue to point to the stuff we need to do that is hard and essential without also being clear about how we're going to make it happen, not just the money, but that is clear key, but in, you know, delivering on other outcomes, which is one of the things I wanted to share with you here in the third resource that I provide related to how to get at equity outcomes related to TCI. So one other thing I just wanted to raise, so I want to have that funding conversation more broadly. I certainly want to have a conversation more broadly about the transportation and all the other good work that you all put out there. I just want to say thanks for all the good work that you outlined on Tuesday. It's a tremendous amount of work that's happening. But I also want to go back to the question I have still about to what level of specificity we get to in our recommendations, and where we sort of stop and send the experts, the policymakers, the providers, the practitioners off with clear guidance and direction to get into a level of detail that I don't think we will be able to deliver. And frankly, I don't think I'm necessarily, when it comes to microtransit and transit, not the right person to answer that level of detail. So I'm trying to understand what's our work and what is the purview of others, and how do we put together a plan that provides clear guidance, clear parameters, but also is clear about where someone else takes the reins. And that I see that in the implementer component of the climate action plan, but I just want to put a finer point on, like, that is not exactly clear to me yet.
Good question, Joey. And I would like us as a committee to return to this question of degree of specificity, so that we, you know, have a common understanding of how detailed we want to go or feel that we must go. We'll return to that question in a minute. Jared, and then perhaps Jane or Marion.
Thanks, Rich. I just wanted to say briefly that I appreciated Chris's comment, and I really agreed with your response, Rich. I mean, I think that what will be in the plan for these really necessitates some kind of delegation and trust and respect for the work coming out of each subcommittee. And, you know, for instance, I fully expect that while I will understand and want to support at a high level the recommendations coming out of the, say, for instance, the Rural Resilience and Adaptation Subcommittee, I am not going to be an expert or have, you know, intimate knowledge of every detail within their recommendations. I am going to be trusting that as a subcommittee with expertise from that area, that they're doing their due diligence. And unless there is something that is, you know, majorly concerning or a major gap, I want to trust their and respect their role in the process. And I hope
He dropped off, right?
Yeah,
Okay.
not just you.
Looks like we lost. So Marion or Jane?
Thanks. Sounds like Jared's still trying to talk, but
true for the mitigation
Oh.
measures in this subcommittee. I agree with Chris. The council needs to be broadly comfortable. It would be appropriate to try to ask every mitigation measures or all of these service dead zone. Hopefully you got the gist of my comments. It's really just saying I do think we need to have committees making recommendations that those committees are more familiar and comfortable with, and that other counselors who are not on those subcommittees have to be comfortable with them at a high level. But I don't think we can ask every counselor to become an expert on every single part of the plan.
that summary right at the end was really great, actually. I have 4 separate points I wanted to make, hopefully that'll respond to a number of the comments that we've heard so far, but in no particular order perhaps, but I did just want to suggest that we have Marion started and it's gone to the crosscut. We have been meeting as a group of cross-cutting themes and ideas with council representation from the 5 subcommittees. We had a meeting earlier this week and one last week where we're looking at the climate action plan outline, making sure that it's refined to speak to the intricacies of how the work is all starting to come together, and making adaptations to the outline in response to those conversations. So we have a revised and updated CAP outline. And in particular, what it tries to do is start to make sense of how these cross-cutting ideas that are coming out of, and actions in particular, that are coming out of different subcommittees will be handled within the body of the climate action plan. First and foremost, we really dove into land use and specifically compact settlement development and how to handle that so that it's not covered in every section where we would speak to it, but is synthesized in a way that shows its cumulative impact with respect to mitigation, adaptation, resilience, and sequestration. So that CAP outline will be circulated and hopefully also come with some clear guidance on process where folks are working on issues that other subcommittees are working on too, about how that roll up will happen. Coupled with that also includes a very detailed CAP drafting process document that speaks to the from the fine grained details of like what font you should be typing your components up in, to how the line spacing should work, to actually oh my gosh, oh yeah, how the actual specificity of what a pathway strategy and the action tables will look like in the climate action plan, so that you all will have very clear guidance on how much drafting goes into bringing your full suite of work up and into the climate action plan. That was circulated also to that suite of counselors. We'll go also to the steering committee and others, but will hopefully be pushed out and down to the subcommittees, especially folks who have sections coming in now for the climate action plan to use as guidance as they're putting that together. I did just want to also suggest that I did see Chris Campany's email. I very much am struggling with and hope that the steering committee and council will grapple with, like, the level and commitment to the amount of information that is coming up and how we're going to do that in a more thoughtful way, recognizing that 20 minutes for transportation doesn't really work. And that's all that's built really into the agenda for a meeting coming up on November 2nd for the next time cross-sector will present. I did, my final comment along this lines is just that around cross-sector schedule, I was mindful that we added extra meetings for the council for the month of November. We added the meetings on November 2nd and November 16th, I think, were the two ones that were added, which gave us some room to bump your next presentation to the council back a week, because it just wasn't all adding up the timeline now for prioritization and finalizing your pathways. So there's a revised timeline and schedule that gives you one extra week now, where the November 2nd council meeting will focus all on cross-sector's final suite of prioritized actions and your writing. So hopefully that still feels really tight, but hopefully it feels a little more manageable. And final comment is that in my check-in this week after the council meeting with David Hill and Liz, who are on the call, we spoke very specifically about some of the requests that I know Liz made about asking for spreadsheets behind the tables that David was showing in his presentation. All of those different components of that work will be shared with task leads in the coming days, specific to your work, to roll into how you're thinking about prioritization and actions. And then you'll expect an email from me trying to set up sort of a final check-in with David and Liz around what the final report of their pathways and communication of their data relative to your sectors will look like, as that is due in the next few weeks from them, and will obviously be helpful as you're drafting your final sections for the climate action plan.
Jane, this is David, if it's helpful for everybody, I was in a hearing all day yesterday, so wasn't able to get very far, but I've got the transportation sector most of the way done, so I can share that workbook just quickly to show what types of things people expect to get. We don't need to take time to do that if you don't want, but I can do it probably in a couple minutes. I see Dave Farnsworth thumbs up.
I would appreciate that.
Yeah,
Okay.
go ahead.
So let's see if I share and I go to the transportation cap summary. Bring it down here. I've been, and we will, so is that showing up? Yep. Okay, so just a summary, and what we'll say is, we'll say this workbook provides tabular and select graphic outputs from our team to the cross-sector mitigation, and we've compiled it, and who else, for follow-ups. But this gives an idea of the LEAP outputs, say the transportation vehicle stock table, by type. Then there's a chart that accompanies that, a vehicle stock summary. So I think we'll do a little post-processing to make these categories so that you have some summary, an element that talks about the VMT reductions that are in the model, the vehicle miles traveled by type of vehicle, the share of EV charging that is managed EV charging, and then vehicle costs. I think those are the main ones that I've just, when I've gone through initially here, pulled out for transportation, and I'm looking through just to see if there's others. This is not every element that's in the LEAP model, but this shows that we can get numeric outputs and graphic outputs and create those. And so we'll be doing that for each of the sectors. I anticipate I'll do buildings next, and then non-energy and electricity. And we'll try to have something to everybody by the end of the day tomorrow.
Thanks, David.
Yep.
Any questions?
Yeah, I have a
So-
quick one. Sorry,
Please.
my hand is up. David, I assume for electricity, we're going to get some of the raw material from the other sectors, because like at least a couple of the things you just showed would roll into the electricity projections. Am I right?
Yeah, I'll try to be thoughtful about the ones that we do for cross, that have the
Yeah,
overlaps.
anything that adds to the load or would subtract from the load before you meet the
Yes.
demand. Yeah,
Yes.
thank you.
No, so you're more of, yes, that's, yeah, so for the electricity sector, that's a good point. We will probably, we'll have sheets from across all of them. And then what I'd suggest we do is, I think Jane and Liz and I, we were going to set up then follow-up meetings with each of the task group leads once we've gotten these workbooks to you.
Thanks,
That's it.
David. Any other comments on any other comments on modeling and questions about the numerical analysis? Do we want to talk next about prioritization and, our own internal reflections on the priorities?
Yeah, and I appreciate, I think that would be a good place, because I think that will kind of refine some of our conversation. And appreciating, I want a special shout out to Brad for his comment in the council meeting on Tuesday around sort of in our work, isn't sort of greenhouse gas mitigation essential, and therefore sort of outside of a prioritization scheme. I'd like to sort of hold that thought in our heads as we're doing this, to see whether, as we've framed it now, works, or whether we would anticipate any adjustments to how we evaluate things as a priority overall, so that we're not losing things in the main body. Obviously, the lower priority efforts will still be included in the plan, but what's at the front of the document will get more attention. And so just wanted to sort of be inclusive of that, rather than, the other path is for us to debate that in full now. And I think it might be helpful to have some information, some real world examples in front of us to understand how the prioritization as it's laid out now racks and stacks with real actions. That makes sense.
Thanks, Peter. Yeah, I agree completely. And I suspect the committee understands this well. So just working through our 4 big buckets. They're listed on the agenda. I don't really care what order we go in. I could ask Joey and Gina, do you want to start?
Yeah, I mean, we have a list. It's written down on a piece of paper. We can share that, or we can just talk about it, walk through it, whatever you want.
It depends on how long the list is. If it's super long, you should put it on the screen.
It's
Otherwise,
not, it's less than 12, but more than 2. So.
Okay. So in terms of priorities, just please walk us through it.
You want to start, Joey? Do you want me to?
Go for it. I might
Okay.
have to peel out because I just got the really fun news that there's a COVID case in my kiddo's classroom again.
God, I hate it when that
Oh.
happens. Okay, so we have several high priority recommendations. First is to join the Transportation and Climate Initiative Program, TCIP. Also in that group is adopt the California. Do you want me to just run through them? I could. Would that help?
I just have a
All right.
question, which might help. Did you enjoy this using that matrix metric thing that Jane
Yeah.
gave us?
It was approximately
Like-
in the backs of our minds. We did not
Yeah.
systematically walk through and talk about each one, but it's certainly, that stuff has been in our minds from the get-go. So it's a rough approximation, and I would
Cool.
welcome conversation about that. I mean,
Sorry to interrupt.
we
That's what I was wondering.
haven't prepared a memo, a justification for these, but we do have a good sense of it that we can talk informally about.
Yeah, and
So-
before Gina digs in, just really, again, we've been very much leading heavily on the EAN pathways that get us to the 2025, 2030. So it's a lot of like, in the short term, electrification and vehicle efficiency and transportation efficiency. So it's sort of, that is through the lens, which I think speaks to the high, medium, low.
These are actions from our pathways and strategies. And I don't need to go
So-
through what those are again, because you guys have heard me say it over and over again what those pathways are. So,
Gina, thank you. Gina, let me interrupt just for a moment.
Yeah, sure.
Jane flashed a hand, and is there
Okay.
something
Yeah.
right now?
I don't think that we need to see it in the spreadsheet today, but I do just wanted to set up the expectation from the way we're putting forward how it'll look in the climate action plan is that spreadsheet will show transparently how all these actions ranked by the 4 criteria, and will also require some comments about how you got to that overall ranking.
in the spreadsheet,
Yeah, and then
Not in
in
the memo.
addition to that, there's the template that we'll use in the document. You will have the opportunity, well, you will be expected, I should say, to speak in verbiage to the 4 foundational criteria alongside of those actions. So you'll just want to be able to transparently state how something got to be a high or a medium priority and what the drivers of that was, and then where there were things to further consider. So ultimately, I think that'll be really important.
bring it on. I'm ready to do that. I want to do that. I don't want to do it inside the box on a spreadsheet, though. I am so eager to do that.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. You'll have, hopefully, someone can help support you, put your bring it on attitude into this.
No, this is what we need to do. I've been waiting.
Yeah.
Let's do it.
Yeah.
Okay.
So maybe to find a middle ground right now between the sort of the work that you've done at this point and towards and through the matrix is maybe if you could be, as you're going through, sort of speak to how things rose to high priority status in your mind in terms of emissions reductions or whatever, without, right? Because I think
Without writing a PhD.
well, it's gonna, I mean, it wasn't an easy exercise by any stretch of the imagination. At the same time, it's difficult for the rest of us to evaluate your brain
Right.
without understanding it. So
Right. Well, so the high priority actions are all based on a clear identified need via the pathways. You know, electrification is very important, having the funds necessary to undertake the incentive programs, the charging programs, all that stuff pushes stuff way to the top. At TCI, we have a lot of research that's been done, a lot of modeling's been done about the benefits, and that's what I hope the climate, the data science and data group will dig into. We've got a basis for moving forward on there. It's been going on for a long time. It's a market mechanism that's going to bring money into the state that we really need to drive the other programs. So that's TCI. I'll stop talking about it now. We could talk about it a lot more.
With the exception, putting a finer point on TCI and a complementary policy.
Yes.
Puts parameters around
Yes.
revenue.
Yes.
Because the
Just
equity
can't-
component
Right.
is very fundamental
Right.
and critical, and thanks.
Yeah, this has got to be driven by equity. Okay, so we have a couple of regulatory programs that are already in place that are having a really beneficial effect on the state, and those ranked very high. We're already doing it. We need to keep doing it, and they're going to get bolder in the years ahead. So those are the California Advanced Clean Car 2 regulations and the Advanced Clean Truck Rule and Phase 2 greenhouse gas rule for tractor trailers. So Those are regulatory policies. The state is involved where it allows us to work at a regional level. We got to keep doing that way up top. Then we get
And-
into,
Sorry,
Yeah.
they deliver what we need to electrify. They deliver cleaner vehicles to Vermonters. So
it's
anyway.
critical. We said that yesterday. It's critical in order to get the cars here. We need these programs. We need the California program. Otherwise, Vermont dealers may not end up with the cars that we need in order to get to the emissions goals. Moving on, public EV charging programs. Obviously, there's a program going on now. We need to figure out how to best expand that. I don't want to give the same talk I just gave the other day to Climate Council, but we learned that VTrans has a grant agreement with VIC to really dig in to figure out how to better serve multifamily housing, that kind of thing. So that the whole EV incentive, building the public charging program is another thing that ranks very high, obviously, because people need to have these things to drive longer distances outside of their homes. Then connected to that is this POC work with the utilities to develop a beneficial charging rates. And this is a cross-cutting issue that Liz was talking about before, that we have to raise up as we electrify everything. And I mean, there's a ton of work that's got to be done at a cross-cutting level. And I'm not sure, I think it's going to happen. It's not absolutely clear to me how it will. EV incentive programs. This too is high priority. So what do we have? We have 1, 2, 3, 4. This is our 5th high priority. And that's evaluating the current programs with an emphasis on how much, for how long, and for whom. And how much, how much is the incentive? How long do we have to have these programs to achieve the numbers of vehicles we need to? And for whom are these for, in terms of income levels and other groups? We also want to make sure, and then the other tinkering, there's some tinkering to the program that's critical. Besides the equity piece is that's getting municipalities, nonprofit entities and businesses to participate, and then obviously figuring out how we're going to pay for it. Also tied to that, so we have this program now, we're going to build it, these incentive programs, we're going to make it better, we're going to expand it, but then also we want to begin investigating a purchase and use vehicle efficiency price adjustment that would be linked to new vehicle sales. So that one, it's related because you're gonna have to tinker with the EV incentives as you get into the incentive disincentive of the purchase and use adjuster. We see that one taking another year or two of investigation, and then linking it up with these incentive programs. So it's up there, but it's on a little different trajectory. And then finally, oh no, excuse me, it's not finally, we have a few more. Supporting the Replace Your Ride Mileage Smart programs, growing those programs, because those are addressing low-income households and saving money through more efficient vehicles and also other transportation options, making them available to those families. So that's right up in the high priority list. We also want to have now we're getting into VMT reduction, increasing transportation choices. Now we understand that the full benefits of those actions will be long-term. That doesn't mean we can not pay any attention to them now. We have to work diligently over time to address transportation choices and land use. So we can't say it's not high priority. It's just we have to be very thoughtful about the kinds of things we're talking about. And our one smart growth, if you will, strategy is to direct federal funds to downtown village centers and other areas with the density and mix of uses suitable for transit, walking, biking, and other non-car dependent modes. That's our one land use recommendation action. Now, we assume there's going to be a lot more coming out of the cross-sectional work, but we're putting that one in there, and we think it needs to happen now with the money that's coming to the state. And then second is to, this one has more to do with increasing transportation options, is this idea of mandating a VTrans to create a sustainable transportation implementation plan. And this will start to work at determining the VMT benefits of smart growth in Vermont, setting up state VMT reduction targets that could then be adopted at state, regional, local plans, and the level investment, figuring out the level investment necessary across modes to achieve long and short-term emissions equity and other goals. So that would start the conversation, but at the same time, we need to continue our commitment in growing transit, bike ped, intercity bus, Amtrak programs, raising them up, recognizing them that together they're part of a long-term strategy that is addressing climate change. I don't have, broadband is just kind of a given. Broadband is a high priority for the state for a ton of reasons, and we want to say it's a high priority for climate change emissions too. So stick that in where you think it belongs, given the larger context around the legislature and broadband. Okay, so
Gina,
those are our high priority. We're getting into medium now.
Can I pause you for a second there? I want to reflect on something relative to the sort of prioritization framework and what we need to do with some of this information is.
Yep.
There is the anticipation that we will take our higher priority actions and run them through with Kaya's help through the equity, the screening tool.
Yep.
That I'm feeling a little anxious that that your higher priority items are not, because they haven't gone through the framework as others probably have done, there will be more of those than would fall out through the way the framework works. And so while ultimately we need to get there, as Jane and Marion were suggesting, it also has impact in the near term as to whether or not we've got that level of analysis done. And so I want to reflect to you that I appreciate the prioritization that you've done. It feels like
I just want to say that
overly
was
subjective in nature.
They were not, that is not in any particular order, what I just said. Those are just high priority. Number one. Number two, I'm about to, at 2 o'clock, I'm going to go work at the food shelf in Craftsbury. I'm on the board of the Hardwick Area Food Shelf. Every single one of these actions, I put through my own screen here in the Northeast Kingdom of how this may or may affect my neighbors who can least afford to be here. So I may not have followed we may not have gone through a formal analysis, but we were keenly aware as we were doing this. And I'm telling you, that's not the end of it. We need to sit down with Kaya. We need to get a lot more, but this was not done blindly.
Yeah, I just want to, I mean, as I noted before, we're leaning heavily on over a decade's worth of work to date when it comes to the TCI stuff, when it comes to, like the EAN pathways analysis, which is undergirded with the state's own best available data and other, so what we're doing is benefiting from the expertise of Vermonters who've been in these conversations for a very long time and putting forward, this, fundamentally, again, electrification, vehicle efficiency, transportation demand management, those are the big buckets. And TCI is a tool to do that. How we calculate the benefits of those programs really has to do with where do we spend the dollars. And that also has to do with the equity screen. So I am waiting for the work of our consultants to further inform this, but this is not this is rooted in, a solid foundation of understanding and significant work to date. So we look forward to applying it through this process, but also looking forward to the final outcomes and further work with the consultants.
So I hear you on equity. We've got to go through that exercise.
Right, so I guess.
We need to hear what happened in those BIPOC sessions. That's so important to this. But as
Yeah.
I'm looking down the list, every single one of these, we talk about equity, every single one of them. It's our little, white perspective of what equity should mean in these various actions.
So I guess I'm not reflecting on the consideration of equity. I'm saying to get to the point where we are effectively engaging highest time.
Yeah.
We need those things that we anticipate to be high priority, and those were defined by and approved by the council to be a certain subset of things. And while I appreciate your judgment, Gina, and your analysis through the perspective of what your neighbors are following with, there's the structure that has been created is intended to be as quantitative as we can to be able to raise those items of high priority. And so there's the things that we've done in the non-energy task, and as an example, is to start with what we anticipate those greenhouse gas impacts to be based on the definitions that we were provided. There are lots of things within the non-energy space that I would prioritize that don't necessarily fall into even a medium priority space based on the ranking that we've been given. And so I don't want there to be, we're setting expectations to the public members who are engaged in this process that you've set high priorities versus the things that I have developed in the non-energy as with the team we've been working with as low or medium priority, but they've been compared to different standards, I guess is my concern.
I don't understand it, but
Yeah.
I'm
So,
sorry. I'm not that bright. Or maybe someone else can help.
All right, Jared, you have a comment on this?
Yeah, sorry, I was trying to raise my hand, but it looks like I clapped. What I was trying to say was, I really appreciate. Oh, can folks hear me?
Yes.
Sorry, I don't know what that was. I appreciate the presentation from Gina and Joey. I also really agree with Peter. I think from a consistency, from an objectivity, from a transparency standpoint, we need to have these in a similar format that connect back to, the prioritization framework. And in the case of emissions reduction, we need to be able to estimate what we think each of these would reasonably achieve with some background assumptions and evidence. I think we have that for some of those that Gina listed as high priority. I think there are some other things that it sounded like you were sharing as high priority, Gina, based on other factors. And I agree that they may be high priority on other factors, but the extent to which we need more clarity on the emissions reduction potential and how to estimate those for some of these different measures, I'm happy to do further work with you and Joey in the task group on that as you fill in that prioritization framework within the kind of format that Jane has shared, and that it sounds like you're really excited to move forward with.
Yeah, I mean, we're talking about TCI, we're talking about the California program, we're talking about public EV charging, we're talking about EV incentives, and we're talking about building up the replace your ride mileage smart programs. And this is not like some brand new crazy thing. These are things that are out there and are going on. And then we're talking about doing better transportation planning so we can get more people onto buses and bikes and walking. I mean, it's not. This is subjective. These are the roots of what the energy plan, the past climate change plans have been talking about. So help us put the numbers onto that stuff and the cost effectiveness, I welcome that, and put it through an equity lens. But is there something here I'm missing? And we haven't even gotten to our medium priority and low priority stuff, which we have per our instructions. I'm maybe I'm just not getting this and need to. But what else do we need to do here?
Gina, I think let me reflect upon your list. Your list of the top, let's say your first 6 items seem to me to be linked together in a nice way along high priority actions that would yield significant emission reductions, and therefore squarely within the scope and mission of this committee. Replace Your Ride and Mileage Smart may not have that many tons associated with them, but they are very highly equity focused, and therefore similarly within the mission of the committee to advance. So I just want to give you a little bit of feedback here that your list makes sense to me. And what we need would be a process that evaluates them consistently with the way other actions of the committee and other committees are going to be evaluated according to the famous pizza pie criteria. And I think that's all doable, frankly. So I'm not hearing objections to these programs. I'm hearing, well, we just need to present the info in a way that makes it transparent. Joey?
I just want to say yes, and we are planning to do that. That is not yet the moment we are in. The moment we are in is bringing you to the degree that we have had the time yet to do the work, like to deliver what is an informed set of recommendations that will be further refined with the consistent, clear case making that I will be the same, parameters that you're all working through. So this is the moment we're in. And we promise to do the work, and I very much look forward to leaning heavily on Jared and others to support the boatload of work we have in front of us when we're talking about transforming a transportation system in a rural state. So we have a foundation on which to build, and we'll work with the tools and look forward to the prioritization and impact analysis.
Okay, thank you. And I'd also note, by the way, that the next list of items that you touched on, Gina, with respect to a forward-looking transportation planning process that has multiple goals, including climate-related goals. As you point out, this is consistent with Vermont policy going back for decades. So this isn't shocking either. They seem to me to be some of them in the category of these cross-cutting topics, particularly the land use related ones, the smart growth related ones, and probably also broadband, where we're going to get similar recommendations from other committees. And as I understand it, we as a council are looking for a way to present a number of those higher level, longer range policy ideas in a way that that saves us from having to bring them up 5 different times in the document, but really just in one place.
I'm at a loss at how they will be prioritized. For example, the smart growth, and do those get a higher priority because it's cross-cutting, or I think that's going to require some thinking. I agree with you, Rich. Electrification is the only known way we're gonna do this. It's the only known way in a few regulatory programs. But if we just walk away and say VMT reduction is unmeasurable and therefore we can't include it, I think we're going to end up like those people in New York. I don't know how many of you watched the video that was shared early on of their climate council gave a report out on their big electrification plans, and they were shot down in a major way because they did not talk about transit, because they did not talk about biking and walking, and they were viewed as elitist nerds who only could count numbers about electric vehicles. So I don't want to end up in that place. So somewhere in this document, and I don't know if it's going to come out of rural resilience or somewhere else, we have to talk about people who can own cars, don't own cars, how they're going to get around in the future, in this green, emissions-free future. We have to address that somewhere in this report. And maybe it's not going to be here. Maybe not. It's not going to be in cross-sector. Maybe we aren't going to have concrete actions around that stuff. But somewhere it needs to be talked about.
That's why there's that cross-cutting issue group to work on those specific pieces, to elevate those things that are nebulous to each one. So I think
as long as they say in there, we're talking about the density and mixes of uses suitable for transit, walking, and biking, and other non-car dependent modes. Because you can't talk about transportation really without talking about land use.
Yep. So I would like to, in the interest of time, I would like us to pivot to another one of the task leads to sort of see how the framework has been implemented. And I got to know from Liz that she and Ed are willing to go next. Dave, I see your hand up, and I'm happy to call you. But I think it might be useful to see another prioritization effort and see how it fits with all of us.
We do have medium and low, but we won't talk about those now.
Thanks. Did I just hear that Liz was volunteering to go next, or Dave, was your hand up because you're ready to go?
I think Liz and Ed are going. I'll follow.
Okay.
Yeah, either way. I was just letting Peter know that we were ready.
Go. Thank you. Go ahead.
Okay, cool. And Gina, on your last point, it feels like we're probably going to all share with one another documents, kind of like we did for the, the spreadsheet before the Climate Council presentations. And that would be awesome, because that way we could all look at the medium and lows and maybe have a little bit more dialogue on how the framework applies that way as well. So, and we can obviously all do the same, send out ours. I don't know, I think Ed's on and has the homework to the extent we were able to do it to share. And ours is pretty straightforward. So one reason for us to go is it might just be a good exercise to tease out some of the other issues we're all going to have in applying this. Ed, do you want me to walk through this and then you can jump in after or as I go along? Is that okay? I'm going to assume the answer to that's yes. You can all see the screen from Ed. So in doing this, just to be real clear, we used the Word document from Jane with the definitions for the priorities, and then we used the cumulative priority ranking, which is on page 4 of the document that she sent us, which indicated that anything that didn't fall within the matrix that she put forward would be in combination considered overall low. So I think the framing things to say when it comes to the electricity mitigation recommendations that we made is because they were put on a solid frame of progress that's already occurred, whereas other sectors have to, make much bigger strides over the short term. Maybe unsurprisingly, ours ended up ranking lower based upon the definitions in the document, but we wanted to show that and have a conversation about it because it looks to be the case in applying the priority ranking that we've all taken a look at, specifically when it comes to impact in 2025 and 2030. Our understanding, preliminary again, based upon the LEAP output that we have seen in the color charts, and it's one of the reasons we want to see the spreadsheet, is that it would rank in accordance with those definitions as low for further mitigation because of the progress that's already been made or will be made before 2030 under current law. And then when it comes to cost effectiveness and co-benefits, big caveats in the notes that I think are really important to point out. Not only does this not include the just transition screening that we're all going to do and should be doing at least individually, even for the lower priority items, but even under the definitions in the document, there are some really big design considerations and electrification assumptions that would go into the rankings for moderate or moderate and high for cost effectiveness and co-benefit. It's very possible to design a res in a way that would not provide good co-benefits or would not be as cost effective. And same with looking at equity and electrification and grid optimization. Those can be designed in ways that promote equity and cost effectiveness and other co-benefits, but they also could not be if not done well. And technical feasibility for all of ours are strong yeses. So I do want to point that out because while lower on the mitigation side, they are implementable and largely based upon things that already exist and could be improved upon. So based upon all of that, our tentative listing is here. None of the 3 specifically electric mitigation steps that the task leads, that Ed and I presented to all of you would rank as above low as we currently understand it. But really important to point out that everything else you all are doing has electrification embedded within it, as well as the resiliency work that we heard from rural resiliency and some of the ag and ecosystems recommendations. So what this would mean is that our work to support those recommendations would shift essentially away from the lower priority items that are here and towards supporting the council and our colleagues on the important electric system and electrification measures that they've identified elsewhere. I'm going to stop there. And Ed, if you have anything to add, feel free.
Yeah, I'll just a little bit about the equity and electrification. Really tried for columns B through D, the 2025 through 2050 impact to just think about pounds or tons of CO2 reduced, and thinking about that entirely separate from equity issues. The upgrades to panels, other things like that are actually fairly low impact until you get to the point where so many houses are electrified that then it's sort of the folks who couldn't afford the electrification. And this is again, assuming just putting equity entirely aside. That's where in 2050, or sorry, yeah, starting in 2050, you really need to get everybody electrified, probably before that. These are rough numbers, these are guesses. Same 100% clean power supply. There's a couple assumptions built into that. It's looking at existing power supply, the length of the contracts that we have now. So even though we actually have a lower carbon power supply than is required by statute, and looking at when those power supply contracts sort of roll off, that's when 2050 came in as moderate, in addition to the fact that it's post 2030 when we're going to see a lot more electrification and a much higher and therefore greater importance, even greater importance of lower carbon power supply. So just wanted to give a little bit there and how we're thinking about that, and need to run the numbers again on some of this, but want to just give you a high level, here's what we're thinking.
Thanks, Liz and Ed. I just have one comment, which I think it's embedded in everything you've said, but somehow the text of the cap will need to draw this out. Because clean power is the foundation upon which the other sectors derive their savings. I think that it's either a footnote or a textual explanation or something should point out that overall prioritization of clean power supply is actually very high. So either continuing or deepening the reliance on clean power needs to be, even though the marginal tons of reduction appear low in your first two columns, frankly, in column H, I would put a high.
Yeah, that's why I wanted to put this up on screen, and Ed and I, in creating it, and the little bit of back and forth we were able to have, that's exactly the conversation we wanted to draw out. I don't think, speaking on my behalf, and I believe Ed's, we don't think these are low priority items in the kind of usual sense we might all consider in a conversation. We're trying to apply specific definitions, and this is what comes out. And I think, to your point, Richard, we need to figure out how to grapple with that, especially when, you're right on the clean power one for sure. It's a continue status quo plus, right? I mean, that's a baseline assumption that has to strongly continue. And then when it comes to equity and electrification, for example, again, making sure that Vermonters have that path and ability is incredibly important. And
Right.
so applying the rigid, I don't want to say rigid definitions, they're concrete, which is good. But we're going to have to figure out how to grapple with that when it comes to the H column. And I think maybe as a subcommittee, consider what we do about it. Because if we're only going to put forward high and medium, some other way has to come about. So I would put it up as a dilemma, because these outcomes, I don't think, would easily make sense to Vermonters looking at the document for the first time.
Yeah, and I would say, though, that qualifying that you could actually have, there's a low impact 2025, probably a low impact 2030, but overall high prioritization. I think it's important to remember that, because in part, this is going to be looking at what kind of legislative actions are necessary, prioritizing the legislative actions. How much are we going to try to get everything done in the upcoming legislative session? Should 100% res be absolutely needs to be done in the next legislative session in order to meet GWSA goals? I think the answer is pretty clearly no. That said, setting a framework going forward, maybe it's the following year. But so I am a little bit concerned. I'm okay with the overall prioritization being high. I'd be worried about that then backfilling columns B and C in particular, because I do think there's a reason to have those be more straightforward.
So I'm going to jump quickly in front of Jane, because I'm guessing she's probably going to say something similar. I could be wrong, but in looking at this, and then this is one of the things I was hoping to tease out from this conversation, was in looking at the way in which the prioritization framework that the council approved works, does it align with sort of Gina's evaluation of what works for her neighbors, right? And if those things aren't in reasonable alignment, then something's probably off with the prioritization framework.
Exactly.
And so sorry to sort of use you as the guinea pigs, Gina and Joey, but we were trying to sort of understand whether the gut check and the prioritization framework aligned, and whether or not we should be recommending adjustment to prioritization framework to the full council. And it seems to me, I'm hearing things along the lines of a sort of is this a kind of prerequisite to other actions, or is this an enabling function? And how does it work in the prioritization there? Could be another kind of column of data that we would need, right? Or to be, and even have, frankly, a sort of a critical, right? This is a critical feature to enabling action. Like I think about it as, let's go back to the transportation space for a second. The installation of electric vehicle charging stations is a critical feature to our rollout of electrification. Does it by itself have a high impact on GHG emissions? No, right? But if you label it as a critical enabling feature, then then it raises that priority status. And so I think there's some thought process there. I'm going to let Jane speak and then maybe suggest a pathway to make some adjustments.
Before Jane speaks too, I just want to make clear, and we should have added a big caveat to column H as well, is this is all without the equity framework. And so to follow up on what you were saying, Peter,
Yeah, for sure.
you know, neither of us would actually come up with the same priority. We would not call equity and electrification a low priority in any means once we add equity in there. This is following the more deliberate, trying to come up with more quantitative steps. So I just wanted to flag that very heavily.
Thanks, Ed. Jane, and then Jared and Brown.
I was going to make a similar comment to Peter, so thank you for that. And I was just going to suggest that I've had open on my computer today revisions to the prioritization document based on the feedback we heard at the council on Tuesday around definitions, and those were relatively minor, but I don't think it would be unheard of. The way we have it characterized right now is that all low priority actions go to the appendix, and medium ones have to come to consensus at the subcommittee level to lift up and carry on with. I don't see why we couldn't clarify also in that language that low priority enabling actions that help realize benefits and help realize high priority and medium priority actions across the other suite that we're putting forward couldn't also be lifted up in that document. And this is a perfect example, and one that Marion and I have actually already, like a week ago, talked about how the prioritization was going to fall flat for things like electrification, these real enabling actions. And so this was what we anticipated to see with this. And I do think we should just caveat the language around how subcommittees can lift up high actions that enable other high priority actions in the work that needs to be done.
Thanks, Jane. I suspect we have a strong agreement on this point about critical and enabling, either critical for equity reasons or critical as enabling technologies. We have to be able to do that and lift up the priorities accordingly. Jared?
Thanks, Rich. This is a great conversation. And yes, on your last point, Rich, fully agree that we need to find a way to call out the enabling actions. I think we'll see this on the thermal side as well. You know, efforts like weatherization have a lower direct emissions reduction impact, but enable switching off of fossil fuel heat that has a much larger one, for instance. But I want to go back to the presentation from Liz and Ed. I couldn't see the spreadsheet because I'm on the phone, but broadly what you characterized sounds very consistent with everything I would expect in terms of not seeing significant emissions reduction from, you know, moving from 75% renewable by 2032 to 100% renewable by 2030, because we have already kind of squeezed out a lot of the high GHG intensity electricity supplies from our portfolio over the years. The one thing that I do want to pull out separately and highlight, though, is the extent to which that modeling was about tiers 1 and tiers 2 of the renewable energy standard. That makes a lot of sense to me in terms of how our generation portfolio changes, our portfolio of electricity purchases changes. The one thing that I think is different, and I don't actually know where it would be modeled because it is really cross-sector, is tier 3. And what happens with tier 3 of the renewable energy standard, because that is directly into fossil fuel reduction in the transportation and thermal sectors, even though we treat it as an electricity sector kind of policy, because how that res kind of policy deliberation and argument plays out, you could imagine that within 100% res, that it could actually have a higher GHG emissions reduction if tier 3 was expanded, or depending on what happens with tier 3, which is just of a different nature than tiers 1 and 2 in terms of how we model our electricity portfolio. Thanks.
Thanks, Jared.
If I can just do a real quick response. We did change here from 100% res to 100% clean power supply to make really clear we're talking about tiers 1 and 2, the electric power supply component, not the tier 3 component. And yeah, Jared, since you're not able to see it, the impact on 2050, and I probably wasn't particularly articulate, recognizes that with increased electrification, even a relatively small amount, even if we stuck with 75% renewable, that 25% is potentially very significant, and reducing that 25%, getting rid of that 25% in the outer years when we have a lot of EVs and heat pumps is really crucial. So basically, I'm agreeing with what you said, Jared.
All right. Thanks, Jared. Bram?
Yeah, just a very brief comment that I think is consistent with some of the ones that have gone on before, which is that, if we looked at electricity production and we were starting at 0 renewables, we might say getting from 0 to 50 is high priority, getting from 50 to 75 is medium, and getting from 75 to 100 is low, which would sort of explain the surprising results on the spreadsheet in front of us. As Jared mentioned, like the electric sector's done the hard work of getting from 0 to 75.
Thanks.
That was my point, but I will see. We will see. I will text you if I did.
All right. Somebody needs to mute. Maybe that's you, Jared.
I think it's just random background noise.
Liz and Ed, thanks. Maybe we should turn to Dave. Thermal buildings. Dave, are you there? I apologize, folks. Perhaps my system is frozen.
No, I can still hear you, Rich. I don't know. Yeah, so Dave may have dropped.
Oh, maybe Dave has dropped, in which case we should move over to Peter. We'd like to hear from Peter anyway.
Okay, I thought I would assume people have heard enough from me today, but Dave's back. Let's go to Dave.
Dave, can we get you? Are you able to present?
Yeah, sorry, I got a call, excuse me. Let me share my screen. And are you all able to see?
You can stay on the babies. We like the babies.
High priority. Right. Are you all able to see this? Okay.
Yes, thank you.
So if I would gotten to answer Richard's first question when we first started the meeting today, my big takeaway from the Climate Council meeting was that I'd really like to be able to do a better job connecting the modeling with the recommendations that we've come up with. The news from David Hill today is really welcome. And so when I went through this and Brian Brian Woods looked over my shoulder a little bit on this, I have to admit, it's sort of a seat of the pants kind of look at things. I tried to apply the definitions that we were given. And I'd like to sort of reiterate a point that Gina made early on, is that we've been thinking about equity ever since, I started in this process back in March. If it were just tons per dollar, this would be a relatively easy thing to do. But when you think about equitable tons per dollar, I don't know if that's the right articulation. It's much more difficult. So anyway, so what we've done here is set out the strategies you see in the second column there, and then the actions. And I'll start with weatherization at scale. As you can see, I think there's a high impact, cost effectiveness, co-benefits, that's technically feasible, and overall high prioritization for funding to get weatherization at scale. It's absolutely critical. The workforce development, financial counseling part of that, because it's indirect, it could be medium. I don't think it's low, but we thought it was medium. But the way the rules set things up. A medium and 2 highs still allow you to get a high. So it comes out, those come out high. Tariff on bill financing, I think, is a potentially really high impact part of this weatherization. So that's how we came up there. The rental property efficiency standard. If this were just tons per dollar, it would be medium impact, because there may be other ways to get greater reductions. I'm not really sure. I hope the modeling tells me more. I may be mistaken about that. But in order to focus on equity, I think it's really important to incorporate that, that rental property efficiency standard. It's a program that's designed to get right at the heart of what we're assuming will be communities that we're talking about, that we're trying to get a better sense of and trying to communicate with. But I think that that focus is important. So the impact may be medium. It may be medium because we're talking about a subset of renters. We're not talking about all rental units. Well, the impact may be medium. Again, cost effectiveness, co-benefits will be significant, and so it comes out high. The other actions down below, energy performance of new buildings. I rank that impact low. Obviously, it's really important, but new buildings are about 1% of the buildings in Vermont. So putting your shoulder to the wheel with this policy, while important in the long run, just applies to a small subset of the buildings that we're talking about. So that's why I ranked it that way, and it came out medium. The clean heat standard, as you can see, is high across, all the way across, as is the adopting appliance standard to locate and control water heaters. I'm happy to discuss why I rank them that way, but like I said, it's as much seat of the pants as anything. So I look forward to your questions, but that's how we came down to it.
Thanks, Dave. Any comments? I have one question. I think, Dave, the modeling will help us in this, but I'm just guessing that the appliance standards impacts might be medium, not high. And it probably depends on how many tons do you have to avoid in order to qualify as high. But this is a modeling question. I'd just like to see some data on that.
I think you're right, Rich. That may be the case. If we took all hot water heaters and made them heat pump hot water heaters, there would be certainly substantial reductions, but they're not huge. Obviously, we need to put a number to that. So substantial and huge are better defined. But thanks for pointing that out.
Peter?
Yeah, I do think that's probably why when we have a little more sense of data, Dave, running it through the sort of breakdown within the existing prioritization framework to see how it falls out, because it's just to see if adjustments are needed or we need to sort of reframe our focus. Because I don't know, I think it's hard to see how, you know, I think one thing to think about, and this is maybe a more important question for us to wrestle with and for Jane and Marion to think about, is weatherization at scale is a package of activities that plays in the same sandbox, right? It's a combination of activities that lead to high impact outcomes. It's hard. So in that way, workforce development and financial counseling are enabling / equity focused activities that make the weatherization at scale possible. But in looking at the GHG impact of workforce development, it's not like, I can't defend a medium rating for that, right? Because it's workforce, it's not leading towards emissions reductions itself. And so I wonder if, Jane, as we think about this, there's a way to call out how these lump together, because we did a little bit of lumping in the non-energy space that may make it more more obvious or rational, or sort of aligned with the way we actually do things, or way things would appear on the ground.
Thanks, Peter. I mean, it's occurred to me that workforce development is something that has come up in a variety of areas and might very well be one of those cross-cutting enabling policies that we want to separately identify anyway.
It is. Our recommendation is to coordinate workforce development efforts. This is just a shorthand. The recommendation isn't to develop the workforce, it is to coordinate the efforts across state government.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that. It's very specific. It's hard to do that in 2 words. I think we all got the point of what you're trying to accomplish. It's more of a, we dealt with this for those who are involved in the Vermont Climate Action Commission several years ago, was to sort of recognize that you couldn't separate out certain actions from each other, that they were critical enablers to the process. And so thinking about it at the strategy level on some issues may make more sense than thinking about it at the action level, and providing guidance there might be useful. I guess I would want to check in on time for the rest of our meeting. We have 15 minutes left. We want to have an opportunity for a robust public comment period. We have the non-energy matters to discuss, of which I can provide you fairly compellingly that other than, we run into kind of the same issues that that the electricity sector ran into, is that other than refrigerant management, based on the sort of framework now, most of our emissions impacts are low. There's a medium impact for the refrigerant piece, but that's as high as we get based on that definition. So, whether or not we do those things, or we push those things forward is sort of separate, but I just wanted to sort of flag that. So I'm not sure going through the data is going to be all that helpful for you, because we've identified the need. We have a really important conversation coming up next week with Kaya and Jen and that team. I'm wondering if it makes sense for us to think through process for, she's going to lead us through some of the work around how we evaluate those. Wonder if it makes sense for us to think about how we want to use that time most valuably. I would suggest that it might be useful for each of the task leads to think about what 2 items you might want to have ready to go for that discussion, or have brought forward, elevated to the point where that discussion should happen, where we can take the things that we've been contemplating in terms of equity and be ready to work through those with Kaya. It's not necessarily that we're going to do all of them, but it's not, go through all of them that day, but we're ready with those in case we think it's appropriate. Does that seem like a reasonable ask?
It's a very reasonable ask, so that we're prepared to, proceed efficiently with Kaya.
Yeah.
Will Kaya be having separate conversations with task leads so to get a better understanding of the sort of the equity implications and the equitable programmatic features that people have in mind?
I think that's kind of what we're hoping to bring forward in that to elevate in our next meeting. Jane, you have your hand up, but I for my conversation with Kaya, I don't anticipate that happening prior to our meeting next week.
Okay, so right now we're getting ready for that meeting, and there aren't going to be separate meetings with Kaya in the meantime.
Definitely not. there's not time, there's no capacity in her budget to meet outside with every task lead. So,
Okay, thank
yeah.
you. So,
Can I just ask one question? So the other ag and ecosystems and rural resilience have an extra week than you guys do. And so I know for them, next week, they're coming to their meeting next week, and Kaya is intending to walk through the guiding principles like in some depth with them, as well as the scoring rubric, just assuming that the broad subcommittee doesn't really feel comfortable with the principles and the tools yet, and trying to get to a common base level of understanding. So one, I just wanted to make a check and see how this subcommittee is feeling without that. And two, I wasn't able to catch up with Peter and Kaya yesterday, but my understanding too with those other two subcommittees is that when they come back together, they'll be pulling their high priority actions as consensus, and then what medium priority actions they want to elevate along with those, and then having a collaborative conversation about across the different pathways that they're pursuing, which actions they want to review collectively as a subcommittee, recognizing that they'll likely only get to, based on the conversation today, you guys won't get through more than one from each of your sectoral leads as a group. And then my understanding and expectation now from Kaya is that as we move forward, the scoring rubric will need to be applied to all actions that are going into the body of the climate action plan. So all high priority and medium priority that you want to lift up, and low priority that you want to lift up. And then that work will have to happen in between meetings with the knowledge and expertise that you've gained from doing it collectively. And then you'll come back and lean into any questions or concerns you had by using the scoring rubric yourself. But she will not support you through application of the scoring rubric on all of your actions. It will just be, you'll want to elevate and think about the ones that are going to help you think through your other ones and ask the critical questions of the scoring rubric that help you apply it more broadly.
Jane, does this suggest that each task lead should have in mind one and at most two high priority actions that we would like to go through with Kaya as an exercise to learn how to apply the criteria and the rubric, and that most of the rest of it's just going to be done by ourselves?
Yes, that is true. And I will say that I had hoped Kaya would provide some clarity through conversations with you both that you could then share, but maybe that hasn't happened yet, but around like what task leads need to come prepared to speak to, or how much overview needs to be happening, and how that actual stepwise process through the scoring rubric will work. And if that hasn't happened, I'll make sure that we communicate that back out to the subcommittee prior to next week.
Okay,
Yeah.
well, I'm meeting with Kaya tomorrow, and maybe out of that meeting, I'll have some info that I can relay to task leads.
Yeah, I think that would be great if we could get there, Rich, just to provide some more clarity as to what to bring and be ready for. But I think, it should mirror what we've been elevating and identifying as we've gone through this about the equity considerations involved. So I don't, as Kaya will admit, she is not an expert in each of these action areas. So she's going to need us to use our expertise to elevate those equity considerations so that we can discuss them.
Right.
So,
okay. Joey?
Is Kaya, or would it be helpful? I mean, there's a lot more work that needs to be done on the equity piece in Vermont, but some work has been done, including like the EIC's energy burden report. I'm just curious if there's like a foundation that we as a full council can collectively build from, that is like that Kaya is aware of, that may help us like build on work that has already been done in this way. Maybe that's, I'm just gonna, I guess, just lean into the process, but I do think that like sort of overlaying some of those places that we have identified as like heavily overburdened, or it may be helpful, or leaning into our community action agencies. I don't know.
I don't know the degree to which Kaya has assembled that information. Many members of this committee have been exposed to it or have worked with it.
Yeah, I think those are the sort of resources that we're going to need to bring to bear, whether we all have equal knowledge of them or not. I think that sharing them around and being good collaborators in this process will be very helpful, because not everybody is probably aware of those resources.
Joey, do you feel like you could send links around to the resources that you have found most useful?
I can try and dig some of those up. I guess I just wasn't sure if that's a body of work that Kaya is already doing or planning to do, so that not, like not just like, oh, read this, you have time, but like, here's a foundation of work and analyses that I know, I think I'm aware of, like the Vermont Law School has done some work here, and I just, or there's, so I don't know. I don't know what it looks like, but it does strike me that that may be helpful.
Right. It's very useful information. I've certainly found the VEIC report and the EAN analysis of energy burdens to be quite useful. There may be others who, have similar data sources that they'd recommend to the rest of the committee.
It feels like that is really helpful work, sort of to build the case for the collective action that we have to take and put in the cap. But then there's, and maybe that gets to your comment, Richard, at a previous council meeting around a suggestion for a just transitions reflection moment, really sort of building the case for the shift that has to happen and how the inequity in the current status quo of fossil fuel consumption. And so I guess I wonder though how that, and if there are specific equity analysis at the action level, because that's what we're then talking about, the shifts that we're going to make because of those problems. Because I haven't asked Kaya to do any of that.
Right. And I think that would require some detailed modeling based upon programmatic details as well. And we don't have the fully fleshed out programmatic details that would enable that exact analysis. I think we can do it roughly and judgmentally, but I seriously doubt it's going to be modeled. So, Peter, I think we've gone as far as we can on this topic right now. And we should turn to inviting public comments.
I would agree with that, Richard.
So members of the public who would like to say something to the committee today, you're invited to raise your hands. So far, I see one hand, Matt Voss.
Hi, can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Sorry, I can't hear you. Could you say that again?
I said, yes, I can hear you.
Okay, great. Yeah, I just wanted to say it's great to see prioritization happening. It sounds good, and sounds like electrification is getting the priority it deserves. I just also can hear the amount of work.
Well, Matt, we lost you. We'll give that a minute for the signal to come back. All right. Oops. So, Matt, we lost you. Are you back?
Yes, I'm here. Can you hear me again?
Yeah, we lost you after the amount of work.
Okay, sorry. Obviously, I can just tell you all are doing a lot of work and it's creating a lot of stress. So just see whether you can find a sustainable transportation option or get some carpooling action happening and go out and enjoy the leaves this weekend, because I'm like Jared and we're driving through Vermont right now and it's absolutely gorgeous. So get out there and remind yourselves what you're doing this for, but keep it up.
Thank you. Some of us would like to be outside right now. All right, everybody. I don't see any other hands up. Anything further from committee members? All right, if there's nothing further today, thank you all, and I hope you get outside to enjoy some of it. Thanks, everybody. We're adjourned.
Thanks, everyone.